She was 22 and already buried a husband. Left at the end of October with $40 and a deed to a broken-down livery stable at the edge of nowhere, Tennessee. The man who handed her the envelope had been her father-in-law for exactly 14 months. He did not look her in the eye when he did it, and what neither he nor anyone else in Harlan County knew was that, hidden beneath the floor of that rotting stable, someone had buried the kind of secret that could bring a powerful man to his knees and give a grieving young woman back everything that had been taken from her. Pull up a chair and let us know where you're listening from tonight, because this is the story of Clementine Boyde. She had not come from money. Nobody would have mistaken her for someone who had. Her father, a blacksmith named Ezra Boyde, had run a small forge on the outskirts of Calhoun for most of his life. He was a man of tremendous quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from emptiness, but from being so entirely at home in the world that words feel unnecessary. He had taught Clementine to work iron the way some fathers teach their daughters to read, early, patiently, and without condescension. By the time she was 12, she could set a horseshoe. By 14, she could read the color of heated metal the way a musician reads notes. He used to tell her, standing at the anvil with sparks catching in his beard, "A good piece of iron doesn't announce itself. It just holds." He died the winter she turned 17, leaving her his forge, his tools, and that saying. She carried his best hammer in her bag wherever she went after that. A short, heavy crosspeen, with a hickory handle worn smooth by 30 years of his grip. It was the only thing of his she'd kept when the forge was sold to cover debts. A year later, she met Callum Pruett at a county fair in August. 2 weeks before the war between them both would begin in earnest, and 3 years before it would be over. He was not the kind of man people noticed right away. He was not tall, not loud, but he had a way of being completely still in a crowd, and Clementine had always been drawn to stillness. They were married in the spring. His family was the most prominent in 3 counties. The Pruetts of Harlan, who had made their fortune in coal before the war and in land acquisition after it. Hezekiah Pruett, Callum's father, was the center of that gravity. He was a man who smiled often and warmly and whose eyes never changed expression when he did. He had wanted for his son a strategic match, a woman with connections or capital or both. What Callum brought home was a blacksmith's orphaned daughter with 40 pounds of iron tools and no last name worth mentioning. Hezekiah tolerated her. That was the word for it. He was never cruel in any way she could have named to a magistrate. He simply made it known, through the careful architecture of exclusion, that she was a visitor in their world. Invited to the table but not to the conversation. Present but not counted. Clementine bore it because Callum made it bearable. He was her counterweight. On the worst evenings, when Hezekiah held court in the parlor and she sat in the corner with her mending and felt herself becoming invisible, Callum would catch her eye across the room and give her the smallest nod. "I see you. I know. Hold on." They built their small life inside the larger cold one. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than she had ever expected. Then Callum rode out, in the second week of September, to look at a parcel of timberland his father wanted surveyed, and the horse came back without him. They found him at the bottom of a ravine the following morning. The fall, the doctor said, had been quick. Clementine stood in the doorway of the room where they laid him out and understood, in a way that had no language attached to it, that the entire architecture of her life had just been demolished down to the foundation. The grief was not dramatic. That was the part nobody tells you. It was not weeping in theater. It was waking up at 4 in the morning and reaching for a warmth that was no longer there. It was muscle memory. It was turning to say something funny and finding only air. Hezekiah gave her 6 weeks. He called her into the study on a Thursday afternoon. In late October, the maples already stripped bare, and the sky the color of old pewter. He was courteous throughout. He explained that the estate had been reviewed, that Callum's share reverted to the primary holding, given the absence of children, that she was of course entitled to her personal belongings. He pushed a sealed envelope across the desk with 2 fingers. $40, he said, a gesture of goodwill. He had also, he continued, arranged to have a property transferred to her name, the old livery stable at the north end of Canaan Hollow, just past the county line. It had been on the Pruett books for years. Nobody had touched it in a decade. It was hers outright. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. She took the envelope and the deed and walked out. She understood the calculus perfectly. The stable was a ruin 8 miles from the nearest town, on a road that turned to mud in November and ice in December. Giving it to her was a performance of generosity that cost him nothing and disposed of her cleanly. He had given her a place to disappear into. She knew it. He knew it. They were simply not going to discuss it. She spent that night in the room she'd shared with Callum, her last night in the Pruett house, and she did not sleep. She sat at the window with his old wool coat across her shoulders and his hammer in her hands, and she thought about what her father used to say. It just holds. She turned the hammer slowly in her fingers, feeling the worn grain of the hickory, the slight cant where Ezra's grip had shaped it over years of use. She thought about iron, how it didn't announce itself, how the best work she had ever done at the forge was the work nobody noticed because it simply, quietly functioned. Before first light, she rose, packed her bag, and left. She did not look back at the house. She had learned from her father that some things, once you've turned from them, you turn from completely. The road north was long, and the morning was bitter. She walked because she had no horse and would not ask for the use of one. The countryside she passed through was a study in late autumn desolation. Bare fields, skeleton trees, the occasional farmhouse sealed up tight against the cold, with smoke rising from the chimney like a flag of warmth she wasn't invited under. A few people saw her. A man mending a fence straightened and watched her go by, with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite suspicion. A woman pulling laundry from a line turned her back. These were Pruett country people. They knew who she was and they knew what had happened, and they had their own debts to worry about. She stopped at midday to drink from a creek and eat the heel of bread she'd taken from the kitchen. She thought about her father's voice. She thought about Callum's nod across the room. She kept walking. The road climbed as it pushed north, leaving the farmland behind for a rougher country of cedar groves and limestone outcroppings. The afternoon light went flat and gray. By the time she crested the last ridge, the sun was little more than a pale suggestion behind a lid of cloud, and there it was below her. A low, sprawling structure at the edge of a hollow, its board siding gone silver gray, its roof bowing in two places where the rafters had surrendered. 3 sides of a corral fence remained. The fourth had fallen inward. A rusted iron hinge had worked itself loose from the main door and left it hanging at an angle, like a man with a dislocated shoulder. She came down the slope and stood before it. Her father's eye looked through hers. She saw what he would have seen, the bones. The uprights were hand-hewn oak, and oak doesn't lie. The foundation stones were dry stacked limestone, fitted with the kind of care that takes time. The ridge beam was still level. Someone had built this to last and then simply failed to maintain it. That was a different problem than a building that was unsound. Unsound couldn't be fixed. Unmaintained just needed someone willing to do the work. She pushed the door open and went inside. The interior was a single long space, perhaps 50 feet by 20, the ceiling open to the rafters. Stalls ran down one side, their dividers mostly intact. At the far end, a cast iron potbelly stove sat in the corner, with its pipe still running to a hole in the ceiling, and beside it a workbench built from 2-inch planks that would have taken 3 men to lift. Leaves had drifted in through the gaps in the siding and lay in shallow drifts along the walls. A family of raccoons had clearly taken a seasonal interest in the hayloft. But the floor was something. Wide plank chestnut, old growth, every board still tight. It was the floor of a building that had been built with genuine pride. It was hers. The first thing in her life that was entirely and completely hers. She set her bag down. The thud it made on the chestnut floor was the first clean sound she'd heard in weeks. She lit a fire in the pot-belly stove that first evening, using pine kindling. She broke from a fallen branch, and she sat on the floor in front of it, with the warmth coming through the cast iron, and she slept better than she had in 6 weeks. The wind came through the gaps in the siding, and the building muttered and shifted around her. But it held. The bones were good. The first days were about survival, then about reclamation. She found a well 30 feet behind the building. The bucket rotted away, but the casing sound, and the water cold and clear when she dropped a stone and listened for the splash. She used the corral fence boards to patch the worst gaps in the siding, pulling the old cut nails with her hammer and resetting them. Her hands knew this kind of work in a way that bypassed thought. She moved through the building methodically, the way her father had taught her to assess any structure. Start with what would kill you first, then work down the list. Fire, water, wind, rot. She addressed them in order. On the 4th day, working on her hands and knees along the far wall, where the floor had heaved slightly near the stove corner, her fingers found something. She had been pressing each board looking for soft spots, for rot that might turn an ankle on a dark morning. Most of the boards were sound, but one, a wide one, maybe 18 inches, situated directly under the workbench, felt different when she pressed it. Not soft, just loose. slightly proud of the boards on either side of it, as if the nails holding it had been removed and reset over the years. She sat back on her heels. Her father had taught her about hiding places. Every old structure has them, he used to say. Men who didn't trust banks. Women who didn't trust men. Somebody always knew something the rest of the world didn't. She worked the hammer's peen into the edge of the board, careful not to split it. It moved. She worked it free from both ends, setting it gently against the wall. Beneath it was earth, packed and dry as expected. But set into that earth, flush with its surface, was a flat iron box about the size of a family Bible. The hinges were hand-forged. She recognized the work, old work, pre-war, and sealed with a small padlock so corroded it had practically become part of the lid. She knew locks. Her father had made them. She found the right angle with the hammer's peen, the mechanical logic of the thing, the single weak point where the shackle met the body. And she struck it 3 times, clean and deliberate. On the 3rd strike, the corroded mechanism separated. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth that had kept it nearly dry for what must have been a decade or more, was a ledger, a folded map, and a paper-wrapped bundle of letters, tied with a piece of twine that fell apart when she touched it. She carried everything to the workbench and spread it out in the failing afternoon light. The ledger was a record of land transactions. She was not a lawyer, but she was a precise reader, and what she saw made her breath come short. The entries spanned 1867 to 1873 and detailed the transfer of parcels throughout Harlan County and the 2 counties adjacent. Each entry had a price, a seller's name, and a notation in a second column that appeared to record a separate, smaller payment made to a third party not named in the official transfer. There were initials beside each of those secondary payments. HP. She turned the pages slowly. HP appeared on 41 separate transactions over 6 years. She opened the letters. Most were between 2 men she didn't recognize, surveyors or land agents by the language. But 3 were different. They were addressed to a man named Colonel Adlard Cruce, who appeared to have been some manner of federal land commissioner in the immediate post-war period. The letters detailed an arrangement. A county businessman was providing Cruce with advance notice of which families were on the verge of defaulting on back taxes or federal reconstruction levies. Cruce would arrange for the foreclosure process to be accelerated. The businessman would then purchase the land at distress prices before the families could find alternative financing. The profit was split, with Cruce's share delivered in cash, and the businessman's identity in the letters was given only as a set of initials, HP. Hezekiah Pruett. She sat with that for a long time, the wind pressing at the board siding and the stove ticking as the fire inside it settled. She thought about the families she'd met in 14 months of living in Pruett country. The Aldersons, who'd lost their bottomland in 1869 and still couldn't say quite how. Old Matilda Crane, who'd been farming a widow's plot and found herself with a tax notice that tripled in a single year and a buyer at the door within a month. She had been told these were the natural casualties of hard times. Reconstruction had broken a lot of families. That was just how it was. It was not how it was. There was also the map. It was a survey plat of the county, hand-drawn and annotated in 2 different inks. In one ink, parcel boundaries and names. In the other, a second hand had marked certain parcels with small crosses and dated them. She matched the dates to the ledger. Every parcel marked with a cross appeared in the ledger within a year of the mark being made. Someone had been documenting this. Someone had built this box and hidden this ledger, and hidden it under the floor of this building that Hezekiah Pruett had owned for 20 years and never thought to look under. She sat with that irony for a moment. The instinct that rose in her first was not anger. It was her father's voice. Build it to last. Get the foundation right or don't bother starting. She could not simply walk into town with a ledger and accuse Hezekiah Pruett of fraud. He was the most powerful man in the county, and she was a widow he'd just disposed of with $40. She would be called hysterical, called a liar, called worse. He would move against her before the ink dried on whatever complaint she filed. No. If she was going to do this, she had to do it the way her father had taught her to build a thing. Carefully, with the right materials, in the right order, with every joint tested before the weight went on it. She needed 2 things. Someone who could read these documents with legal eyes, and someone who had enough independent standing that Pruett couldn't simply make them disappear. She spent the next week making the livery stable into something that could sustain a person through winter. She repaired the 2 worst sections of the roof using salvaged boards and a technique her father had shown her for overlapping the grain to shed water. She reset the main door on a new hinge she forged herself at the small hearth she built in the corner. The first real ironwork she'd done in over a year, and when she felt the hammer's weight find its rhythm again, something in her chest loosened that she hadn't known was clenched. She bought supplies from a dry goods store in the next county north, paying with some of the $40, and accepting the storekeeper's curious look with composure. She was nobody there. That was a relief. She bought flour, lard, salt pork, cornmeal, a paper of needles, and a coil of good wire. She walked back with it all in her bag and on her back, and she didn't mind the weight. It was on one of these supply trips that she heard, in the way you hear things in small towns, sideways, through half-sentences and knowing looks, about a woman named Lottie Vay. Lottie Vay was a schoolteacher who had been removed from her position at the Harlan County Grammar School 3 years prior, over a dispute about the textbooks she was using. The official reason given was curricular. The actual reason, which everyone in 3 counties understood perfectly well, was that Lottie Vay had refused to stop teaching the children of the families. Hezekiah Pruett had run off their land, had in fact been holding informal classes for those children in her own home, and had made several pointed remarks in public about where the Pruett land holdings had come from. Hezekiah had called in a favor with the school board. Lottie Vay had lost her position and her income and been reduced to giving music lessons to make rent. Clementine found her address and knocked on her door on a Friday evening in early November. Lottie Vay answered the door herself. She was a small woman in her mid-40s with very dark eyes and the manner of someone who has been waiting a long time for something and has made her peace with the waiting. She looked at Clementine with frank assessment. "You're Callum Pruett's widow," she said. "I am," said Clementine, "and I have something I think you need to see." There was a silence, precise as a held note. Then Lottie stepped back and opened the door wider. Clementine spread the ledger and the letters on Lottie Vay's kitchen table, and she watched the woman's face as she read. Lottie was very still as she turned the pages. Her expression did not change, but her stillness deepened in a way that Clementine recognized. It was the stillness of a person whose worst theory has just been confirmed. "I knew it was deliberate," Lottie said finally, her voice flat and very controlled. "I could never prove it." She looked up. "Where did you get this?" "Under the floor of the stable he gave me to die in," said Clementine. Something shifted in Lottie's face then. Not quite a smile. More like the expression of a woman who has just realized the board she needed was right there all along. They talked for 4 hours. By the time Clementine walked back north in the cold dark, she had her first ally, and more than that, she had a plan. Lottie knew a federal circuit attorney in Nashville, a man named Hargrove Bain, who had been trying for 2 years to build a case against fraudulent land transfers in the region, but lacked the documentary foundation to proceed. The ledger and the Colonel Cruce letters were that foundation, but the approach had to be careful. Hezekiah Pruett had tendrils in the county courthouse, the local newspaper, and at least 2 of the magistrate positions. Any move made through local channels would be smothered before it reached daylight. The play had to go above his head entirely. It took 3 weeks to get word to Bain through Lottie's connections, using a letter that never named Pruett directly, but described the evidence in terms precise enough that a trained attorney would understand exactly what was being offered. Bain replied within 10 days. He would come in person. In the meantime, Clementine kept her head down and her fire burning. She was seen in town once a week, buying supplies, exchanging nods, giving no one anything to look at. But something was quietly shifting in her small orbit. It started with a boy of about 12 named Toby Alderson, who showed up one morning and silently stacked a cord of firewood against the south wall of the stable without being asked or paid. When she came out to thank him, he just shook his head and pointed north, toward the old Alderson bottomland, visible as a cleared field in the distance, now farmed by tenants who paid their rents to Pruett. She understood. After that, others came in the way of people who have been waiting for a direction to lean. A woman named Persimmon Wells, whose maiden name had been on one of the transferred parcels, brought a winter squash and a jar of put-up peaches and sat at the workbench for an hour, listening to Clementine work the iron. She did not ask questions. She just wanted to be near something that felt like it was moving forward. A man named Arden Foss, who had once been the county surveyor before Pruett had found a reason to have him replaced, came on a cold Tuesday and spread his own copies of county plat maps across the workbench. He and Clementine spent an afternoon cross-referencing his records against the ledger, and what they found tightened the case further. 6 of the transactions in the ledger had county survey records that had been altered after the fact. The original figures ghosted through the paper, where someone had erased and rewritten them. That's not just fraud, Arden Foss said quietly. That's document falsification on a federal record. That's a different category of crime entirely. It was, and they both knew it. Hargrove Bain arrived on a Wednesday morning in early December, stepping off the Knoxville stage, looking like a man who had spent 2 days in a coach and intended to make it somebody's problem. He was in his 50s, compact and sharp-featured, with the manner of someone who had learned long ago not to announce what he was thinking until he was finished thinking it. Clementine led him to the stable, spread everything on the workbench and stepped back. He read for an hour without saying a word. When he was done, he stacked the pages carefully and looked at her for the first time since he'd sat down. "Where did you say you found this?" "Under the floor," she said. "Of the building Hezekiah Pruett gave me to get rid of me." He looked at the floorboards for a moment, something moving through his eyes that might have been the particular satisfaction of a man who has been handed exactly what he needed. 41 transactions, he said. 6 falsified federal survey documents, and letters that directly implicate a named federal land commissioner. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, with the economy of a man who only nods when he means it. Then he picked up his pen. What followed was not a courtroom confrontation. It was quieter and more thorough than that. Hargrove Bain worked through channels that ran above the county entirely. The Federal District Court in Nashville, the Department of the Interior, a congressional committee that had been keeping a file on post-war land fraud across the Reconstruction South for the better part of a decade. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply built the case, piece by piece, with the ledger and the Cruce letters as the load-bearing walls. Clementine was never required to appear publicly. That was, Bain told her, by design. A deponent who was also the deceased son's widow, and also the person who'd found the evidence, would give Pruett's lawyers too many threads to pull. The evidence spoke for itself. She had simply been the one to find it. The first sign that something had changed came in January, when the county land office in Harlan received an unannounced visit from 2 federal examiners who spent 4 days going through deed transfers from 1866 onward. They were polite and gave nothing away, but they took copies of a great many documents. The county clerk, a small nervous man who had always existed in the long shadow of Pruett's goodwill, was seen afterward looking considerably paler than usual. The second sign came in February. Hezekiah Pruett canceled his scheduled appearance at the county commissioners' meeting and was not seen publicly for 2 weeks. The third sign came in March. A notice in the Nashville Banner, a single dense paragraph near the back of the paper, reporting that a Harlan County businessman had agreed to a civil settlement with the federal government regarding certain land acquisition irregularities in the post-war period. The settlement included the return of 43 parcels of land to their original families or their heirs, plus a financial payment, the terms of which were not disclosed. The name in the article was not printed, but in Harlan County and the counties adjacent, there was only one name it could have been. By April, the great Pruett holdings had been broken like a fever. The coal leases went first, then the bank interests, sold under terms nobody in town had ever seen Hezekiah accept. Terms dictated to him rather than by him. The White House on the Hill was put on the market in May and sold in June to a family from Knoxville, who had never heard of the Pruetts and couldn't have cared less. Hezekiah himself relocated to a house in Nashville that was, by all accounts, quite comfortable but entirely ordinary. He was not imprisoned. The settlement had foreclosed that possibility by design. Bain had explained it plainly. A quiet resolution returned the land. A trial that dragged through the courts for years might have returned nothing, while lawyers ate the estate down to the studs. The land went back. That was what mattered. Clementine learned about the settlement from Lottie Vey, who had been appointed to her old teaching position again the week prior. The school board, under new appointment following one commissioner's quiet resignation, had voted unanimously to correct what they now described as an administrative error. Lottie's letter was 2 pages long, and the last line simply read, "I thought you should know. The Alderson boy came back to my class yesterday. He's very quick." She read the letter twice, standing in the doorway of her stable, with the spring sun coming horizontal across the hollow and the sound of a creek running high with snowmelt somewhere below the ridge. She folded it and put it in her pocket. The livery stable was not a livery stable anymore, in any meaningful sense. She'd converted 2 of the stalls into a proper workshop, with a small forge she'd built from salvaged brick and the cast-iron door of the original potbelly. It drew well. She was doing ironwork now, commissions, small things mostly, But word had spread to the town at the north end of the county road and beyond it. Hinges and hooks and fireplace cranes, a gate for the Methodist church on the hill, brackets for a new mill in the next hollow. She'd hired a boy to help with the bellows 3 days a week. She was making enough. Quietly, without drama, she was making exactly enough. People knew the rough outline of what she'd done, or they believed they did. In the way of small communities, the story had been simplified and mythologized in equal measure. She was the woman who'd brought Pruett down. She was the widow who'd found something in that old stable. She was, in the language that attached itself to her, without her consent, Clementine of the Hollow. She didn't correct the stories. She didn't tell them either. She just worked. On a morning in early May, when the redbuds had come out on the hillside, and the hollow smelled of new growth and iron and hickory smoke, she stood at her forge and felt her father's hammer find its rhythm in her hand. The metal she was working was a simple thing. A set of cabinet hinges for a family rebuilding their farmhouse on land that had just been returned to them after 16 years. She was making them from bar stock she'd shaped herself, each leaf sized to fit, each knuckle fitted to turn without binding. She held the near-finished piece in the firelight and thought about her father standing at his own forge, hands black with scale, voice like gravel. It just holds. She thought about Callum's nod across the room, that small private language between them. She thought about Colonel Cruce's letters, and Lottie Vay's dark eyes at the kitchen table, and Arden Foss's careful hands on the plat maps. She thought about $40 and a deed to a building that was supposed to be her ending. She set the piece on the anvil, squared the hammer, and struck. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What we walk past every day. Assuming it's broken, assuming it's worthless, assuming the story is already over. Sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do is walk into the place someone handed you to disappear in and look down. What hidden floor have you been walking over without ever stopping to listen?